distributed to more than 40 countries. As an international lecturer for the Theosophical Society and other organizations, he travels widely across Europe. He is the founder of the School of Applied Wisdom based in Leeds and also helps to run Leeds Theosophical Society. He has been a lifelong student of esoteric ideas and occult science and is a dedicated explorer of consciousness. He is a lover of the natural world and lives in the Yorkshire Pennines with his cat Electra. Tim?
Okay, thank you very much, Iphigenia, for that. And welcome everybody from, well, we call it here God's own country, which is Yorkshire, but wherever you are, welcome. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that we can all link up in this particular way. Now, this virus, I mean, it's had a peculiar effect on just about everybody on this planet, and even people like me who are quite reclusive. Even people like me are going a little bit stir crazy. But it does give us the opportunity to pause and think about some of the other implications of all this viral pandemic. And one of the things which I found it fascinating to explore, and one of the things I want to talk about this afternoon, is this idea of how we are all connected mentally. I'm going to be talking about this in some greater depth at the European School in October. But I wanted to mention one or two things which are in that talk, because I think they're very pertinent to this idea that I'm trying to propose this afternoon. We tend to think that the world has only just become connected in the last few decades or centuries through trade, through telecommunications, through air travel, more recently through the internet and all the digital technologies. Of course, there's always been a collective human mind. It's arguable that that may be more enmeshed and more entangled now than it has been in the past, because we are all communicating with each other. What are the effects of us communicating with each other to a greater degree? Well, during the last century, research tends to indicate that intelligence generally increased by about 30%, which is massive in a period of 100 years. They did a number of tests. They tested soldiers in the American Army when they were drafted in 1917. These were farm boys from Iowa and people from very remote communities. And they got a particular IQ score, and it was below 100, well below 100. When they tested soldiers again in 1941, when America came into the Second World War, they found that there was a 10% increase during that time. Now, what had changed? Well, we'd seen radio, more television, well, more films. Obviously, television hadn't arrived at that point, but there was greater communication. People were able to travel and meet each other much more. And so I think that this viral pandemic has shown a number of very important esoteric truths. And let's remind ourselves of what those are. Theosophy, one of its core principles, is the idea that there is one life, differentiated into innumerable different parts and different aspects. But essentially there is one life, and we are all part of that. For a long time in the West, we've pursued this idea of individualism, that we're all individuals, that we all are in charge of our own destiny, and that we all have our own separate individual consciousnesses, and that we have our own separate compartmentalized minds. And all the thoughts we get are original, and everything we imagine is something new. And yet this is certainly not the case. We are all part of a mass collective mind, and we tap into this either consciously or unconsciously all the time. And this mass mind is largely created unconsciously through the thinking of everybody on the planet. But as we know, a lot of the thinking which human beings engage in is very emotionally based. And during this pandemic, you can see how emotions have become more raw. Emotions generally over the last decade or so have become much more raw. Last year, at least, people in half the countries of the world were protesting about something or other, usually about their governments. We had the yellow vests in France, we had the Me Too movement following all those terrible revelations about things that had gone on in Hollywood and other places. And then, of course, most recently, in the last 8 or 9 days, we've seen this global reaction, perhaps an almost unprecedented reaction to the killing of this man in the United States, Mr. Floyd. Now, this has happened many times before, many times before, but for some reason, this time it has gained a traction and an energy, and it's gone right round the world within a few hours. We have to ask ourselves why that is the case. Why does it suddenly happen now, in the middle of this global pandemic? What are the trigger mechanisms for this? But we also have to remember another important theosophical truth here. And it's one that only a very small minority of people as yet accept. And this is that our minds do not require brains in which to function. Our minds do not require brains in which to function. The brain is a processor on the physical level, but it's a receiver of information. It's not necessarily a storehouse. And the scientists have argued about this for decades, about what consciousness is, where thoughts are stored, and all the rest of it. We know that the mind exists outside the temporary physical body. And the more people begin to realize this, and I think a lot more people are starting to realize it, then it's a game changer, because it means this idea of isolated individuality is slowly beginning to blur. And we do realize how intimately interconnected we are. One of the first things which I think sparked this idea that we are all on this one planet together, was when those first photographs were taken by the first astronauts who got outside the Earth's orbit, and they took pictures of this fragile blue planet which we all live on. That almost started the modern consciousness about ecology, about the environment, and about how important it is to preserve our host planet. In the intervening decades, thanks to the pioneering work of many people, not least people like James Lovelock, who propounded the Gaia theory, that the Earth is a living, breathing organism, which we knew anyway, but now more people are beginning to understand that one action by one person actually contributes to the whole. And what I hope is that more and more people are going to realize that their thoughts also produce a body of the earth, a mental body, which they themselves affect. Because global consciousness is about all the thoughts which are going on at one time. So what produces this interconnectedness? What produces this kind of consciousness which connects us all? Why do we have numinous feelings for people who live perhaps across the globe, or people we haven't seen for a long time? How do we explain things like psi phenomena, telepathy, precognition, those kinds of things, clairvoyance, clairaudience? Well, we explain that through a substratum or a spiritual substance, which we know as the astral or akasha. This is the communication medium. Now, of course, akasha is a Sanskrit word which means ether, or a transmission medium, if you like. So the ether, along with its alter ego, we might call it that, the astral light, explains this interconnectedness which we have. as well as these various psi phenomena, which science tries to debunk but cannot explain. So nothing is exempt from this astral fluid, we might call it that. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but let's call it a fluid. And of course, this is the template for everything that was, that is right now, and that will be in the future. And it's the transmission agent for each individual's karma in any one particular life. And it also accounts for things like dreams, memories, as I say, clairvoyance. And it works with our bodily and mental fields. Now, in its original state, of course, the Akasha was quite pure, but because human beings are far from pure, the Akasha itself becomes very polluted. And so it's very much a double-edged sword. It can be a friend and it can also be an enemy. Now, this idea of entanglement of minds has been studied scientifically quite extensively in recent years, but of course there always remains that hardcore, the majority possibly still, of scientists who refuse to accept these things. There are many scientists who really are very, very uncomfortable with the discoveries made by quantum physics. The idea that a particle can be in two places at once. The idea that a particle behaves differently depending or not on whether you observe it. And these things are very, very difficult to explain in a world which is still largely left-brained, logical, linear, materialistic. And it's this materialistic dominance by science which really stops us exploring a lot of these ideas of entangled minds. So I would say that things can change very, very quickly here, and that attitudes can change. And that really Theosophy at this particular time is so, so important to the world, not as an organization, but because of the ideas which it's been trying to put out to the world for the last 140 odd years. This idea that life is all connected, and this idea that there is far more, far, far more than just the physical aspects. In my last talk, I tried to look and ask some of the questions about the esoteric causes of this particular pandemic, because although it may have emerged from China or wherever it's emerged from, it is not necessarily the point. The point is why it has emerged at this particular time. And I suggest that collective human consciousness and possibly collective human karma, more importantly, is a very important fundamental part of all this. And that this is some kind of payback. In my next talk, I'm going to be talking about how we are at this tipping point, something which has been recognized for quite a long time now. We get writers going back into the earlier parts of the 20th century who were pointing out that a major change is occurring on Earth. 120 years ago, the Theosophists then were talking about this great spiritual awakening which was undergoing humanity. And although we might not see it in that particular way, it is quite clear that human attitudes to many things are changing, particularly to their own spirituality. Just this morning, I was reading the latest research in America by a very well-respected organization called Pew Research, and they do research into all sorts of attitudes on, particularly on religious and spiritual matters. And in a country like America, which relatively speaking is still a very religious country, around a quarter of people polled now describe themselves as spiritual rather than religious. Now, spiritual rather than religious is a slightly generic and woolly term, but nevertheless, it gives you a feel for the direction of travel, where all this is going. People are starting to understand that despite what religion has forced down their throats, despite the insistence of mainstream science, they realize there is more to them than just their physical bodies. And it's also provoked many questions about people's own sense of survival after the death of the physical body. And this is another classic example, really, of how minds become entangled and how attitudes can change relatively quickly. We tend to think often that change is imperceptibly slow, particularly in those areas where we would want change to happen more quickly. But this virus has shown us that there is something at work here which is opening us up spiritually. And in many ways, we've seen so many acts of kindness, so many acts of compassion, so many acts of people doing things they wouldn't normally do to help other people, which have emerged from this. And this is another dimension to it. We should never forget as Theosophists that despite all our wonderful teachings and despite all our apparent knowledge of some of the inner workings of the universe, at the heart of all this, there is a morality. There is a morality which really we have to follow. And this is so important. And when we look around the world and we see that there is mass immorality in virtually every nook and cranny of our lives, and this mass mind, this entangled mind of humanity is now beginning to question that. That's why we're getting so many demonstrations. This is why we're also starting to question things a lot more. More and more people don't believe anybody. They don't believe the politicians. They don't believe the journalists, quite rightly. They don't believe people in authority anymore. They certainly don't believe in a financial system which can be manipulated so easily by a very few people. And it seems to me that more people are realizing that compassion and the kind of capitalism we have at the moment are entirely incompatible. And so what people are screaming out for, what the collective voice of humanity is increasingly beginning to demand, is an economic system which shows some level of morality and which serves the people rather than serving the people who run the banking systems. But this is happening on every single level. People are now really beginning to question so many things. Amongst the other protests last year, which was welcome to some and irritating to others, were the people who were taking fairly extreme action, the Extinction Rebellion people, to draw attention to what we were doing to poison the skies and the waters and the earth and all the rest of it, and how climate change is becoming a huge factor in everybody's life. Now we're seeing people beginning to question things like this new 5G technology. And this morning I was sent something by one of my friends, and I'd read about this before, but this stuff is actually very, very frightening. I thought, perhaps until today, that people like David Icke, who was saying this represents a threat to life as we know it. I thought it was David Icke just being David Icke and perhaps being over the top. I have no doubt now that this is another technology which is not just going to affect the human population, but it's also going to affect the other kingdoms of nature. And this is something else which is starting to get more and more important in people's consciousness, this idea that we are not alone as a species to plunder and rape and rob this planet. We have responsibilities to those other kingdoms of nature because we have come through those kingdoms of nature. They are our younger siblings, and we have a duty and a responsibility to them. And so we're developing, whether the authorities like it or not, we are developing a consciousness which is starting slowly to recognize that we are all interdependent and that all these kingdoms of nature operate supposedly in a harmonic way together. And if we're going to introduce more technologies which are actually going to endanger us, we are splitting this planet in two. And this bifurcation of attitudes, if you like, almost exactly parallels what we know of what happened in Atlantis all those many thousands of years ago, when the society polarized into two groups of people. The lords of the dark face, the people who wanted to manipulate matter, who wanted to preserve materialism and extend it, and the lords of the shining face, who wanted to prevent all those things and wanted to prevent these terrible experiments on nature. You know, when the Americans exploded one of their airborne test nuclear devices in the 1950s, and this was an airborne device, not a ground-based device. I think this was in about 1953 or 1954. Already by that time, they developed a bomb which was 50 times more powerful than the bombs which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And they didn't know whether this was going to destroy all the oxygen in the skies, but they went ahead anyway. So this morality also has to extend to science. And I think this is what people are beginning to understand, because although people have become very, very seduced by technology, almost enslaved by it in some respects, technologies which were meant to free us have actually imprisoned us and trapped us to some degree. I'm not anti-technology, I am simply against technology for technology's sake. And it's now become like humanity's main crutch. Science stroke technology can solve all our problems. Well, science and technology may well have been the architects of many of our problems. And I think that this is something we have to recognize. So the world is very inflamed. Its mental and emotional body is in a state of turmoil at the moment. And we are seeing protests. We're also seeing outbreaks of mob mentality as well. And I'm not just talking about people going on to the streets to protest, but I think we see it in many other ways as well. It's never been easier than it is at the moment to manipulate people's minds, because there are so many different means of doing it. It's almost though some people who actually think about these things are almost becoming information resistant, because they don't know, as I said earlier on, they don't know who or what to believe anymore. But nevertheless, human consciousness is undergoing a revolution, the likes of which it hasn't seen for a very, very long time. And wars and conflicts are always the catalysts for these sort of things. Always. You always get huge changes in attitudes after wars and when conflicts start to visit various countries or localities, or in this case, globally. And so that is another side effect of all this. It's actually a consciousness raising agent, despite the trail of destruction, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have died, the fact that billions of people are going to face severe economic hardship for a long time to come. I'm not trying to downplay this whatsoever, but what I am saying is that one of the invisible effects on this is to do something to strengthen the human spirit. And the human spirit has been extremely strong during this. We've seen outstanding examples of this. Here in England, there was this old boy was 99, he's now turned 100, called Captain Tom Moore, who walked up and down his garden to raise money for the NHS. He aimed to raise about £2,000 and he ended up raising 33 million. 33 million. This shows you how new ideas, how something can get traction very, very quickly. And so here, for all of us, is an opportunity for us not to evangelize to the world, but to try and spread these ideas, these important theosophical ideas, so much more effectively, perhaps, than we have done in the past. And these are ideas whose time has come, because our ideas are about, we invented the idea of inclusiveness long before it became one of the buzzwords of the 21st century. We also knew all about diversity before all that. We knew that everything was connected to everything else anyway. And now we're being shown that in a very tangible way in the world. So the whole thing about this virus has been a fascinating exercise in mass psychology of one sort or another. It does show you how people can pull together. It also shows you how, whatever rules you make, there will always be some people who will break those rules and who possibly don't think that those rules apply to them. But nevertheless, it has had a very, very cleansing effect in many ways on a lot of people. The world has quietened down. People have had time to think. Some people don't like thinking, and so it's driving them mad because they can't do the normal things. But a great many people have been forced in on themselves. And whether they like it or not, they have kind of de facto begun some kind of inner questioning, which is the first part of the spiritual quest. So this idea of entangled minds is something which, as I say earlier on, has been explored in a number of different ways over recent years. And I'll be explaining this in some greater detail in October, but I'd like to touch on one or two of the things which seem to give some scientific evidence that these things might well be true. Many of you will have heard of Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist, who is an extraordinarily interesting and brave individual, because he's gone against mainstream science in trying to show how some of this interconnectedness actually works. And he's done various experiments over the years, one of the most famous of which was when he tried to show that there is this bond and interface between pet owners and their cats and dogs, especially. Those of us who have pets are quite aware of this, as pet owners always have been. But he wanted to demonstrate this. And so he devised a series of experiments to show that dogs knew when their owners were coming home. And in order to get rid of ideas of routine or hearing the same car drawing up outside the house each night, he varied it in a number of different ways. And the dog seemed to react not when the person left their office, but when they had the intention of leaving their office. So they might have intended to leave the office, got up, and then a phone call's come through and they've sat down again. But at the moment that they intend to leave, the video camera in the house filming the dog shows the dog suddenly getting up from the couch and becoming quite animated and excited about the anticipation of its owner coming home, and no doubt getting some food in the process. Rupert Sheldrake developed this idea of this medium, this field, which he called morphogenetic or morphic fields. And this is an extremely interesting idea. Of course, the mainstream scientists thought it was completely incorrect and just usual airy-fairy New Age stuff. But Sheldrake also did a number of experiments which involved finding out, these are quite complicated, so I won't go into it, but he basically, when you get that feeling that someone is looking at you and you can't actually see them, but when someone's kind of looking at the back of your head, well, he actually did various experiments and had control tests and proved that in most instances, when people felt this, it was true, because somebody is impinging on your individual field. And this is clear evidence that we have these fields and that they are intermingled in some way. Now, obviously, a lot of these interactions which take place between us are quite unconscious. Sometimes we meet people and we are instantly attracted to them, or alternatively instantly repelled. Now that might be something to do with karma, but it might also be to do with the fact that we all give out different vibrational rates, and some of those vibrations are extremely incompatible with one another. Another very interesting aspect of all this is the work done, and I mention these people very frequently because I think the work they do is fascinating. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is based in the United States. This was an organization that was set up in the 1970s by, amongst other people, Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. And Mitchell, when he was up there in space, had a profound spiritual experience. And it was an experience that went against all his training as a physicist and as an astronaut. It was completely counter to all that. He suddenly saw the stars and all the universe in front of him as one big interconnected whole. And this went against his whole training, which was to segment everything into classes and different divisions and all the rest of it. He saw it as one, and he set up this organization to try and look scientifically at some of these important questions that we as Theosophists ask ourselves all the time. Who are we? Where did we come from? How do we operate? Why are we here? What's our mission? And one of the interesting things which they did was to form this thing called the Global Consciousness Project. This was a prototype of this was actually set up in the 1990s. And the idea was, and is, they set up random number generators in a number of locations around the world. And these things just churn out endless random streams of ones and zeros all the time. But sometimes they start to show coherence. They suddenly stop generating random sequences of numbers, and they start showing coherence. And they discovered that this coincided with major events. Some of these major events were just local or regional, others were global events. And one of the things which they found was that when Princess Diana was killed in Paris in 1997, this affected the random number generators, not just in Paris, not just in Europe, but all around the world, because Diana was arguably the most famous woman in the world, the most photographed, a glamorous figurehead of a woman with her own difficulties, but nevertheless a global figure. And so these random number generators reflected all that. And more interestingly, as with other events which they've measured, these random number generators didn't just start to behave non-randomly at the moment that that car hit the pillar or at the moment when Princess Diana died, but prior to these events, which suggests that this global consciousness has a predictive factor. And this is sometimes called by investigators presentiment. It's certainly, that's the term that Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, that's the word that he uses. So on the basis of this, they started to widen this global consciousness project, and it became apparent that when the next arguably major world event occurred 4 years later, in September 2001, when the Twin Towers were hit by those planes, there was a similar reaction, a very violent reaction of these random number generators. And again, it happened before the planes had actually hit. So it seems that somehow this global consciousness was aware of something that was going to happen. Also, and this is sometimes disputed, but it's often said that those planes which were involved in that had fewer people on them on that Monday morning than they otherwise would have had. Also, it does appear that there were fewer people actually in the Twin Towers on that particular morning, fewer than would normally have been imagined. So if this is the case, then it means that somehow our concepts of linear time also are wrong. But what is also wrong is this idea that we all have these kind of separated bits of consciousness which just float around our own heads. Our own consciousness is actually very promiscuous. It's actually there interacting with all sorts of other consciousnesses all the time. You know, as soon as we think of someone at a distance, that has an effect on that person, whether we recognize that or not, it does. Whether that idea is hostile or an act of love or an act of even indifference, although if it was indifferent, you probably wouldn't be thinking about them. But, you know, whether it's positive or negative, our thoughts make the world that we live in. We have this saying in England that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that is absolutely not true. Words and thoughts can be as wounding as physical acts. Now, we don't just impact on each other's consciousness, we also impact consciously to some degree, but more often unconsciously on the other kingdoms of nature. Our attitudes to the kingdoms that we can see, the mineral, the vegetable, and the animal kingdoms, we don't believe that we necessarily have much mental power over these, but we do. And something else that we also fail to realize, something which I'm actually researching at the moment and finding hugely interesting, are those other hidden kingdoms of nature that we talk about so often in Theosophy, but don't really elaborate on. And here I'm talking about the nature spirits and elementals. And I'm also talking about that parallel stream of life which runs next to human life, the angelic or David kingdoms. Now, in recent years, as we've industrialized, as we've moved from the countryside and into cities, as we become much more materialistic and supposedly rational, these kingdoms have been squeezed further and further to the margin. But one of the things which I'm sure is going to happen in the coming age is that we are going to start to have a much closer relationship with these kingdoms, with the David kingdom in particular, but also with the nature spirits as well. Because our thoughts do affect these kingdoms perhaps even more profoundly than the mineral, the vegetable, or the animal kingdoms. And this is an area which is also going to open up. But these kingdoms apparently have become very repelled by the coarseness, perhaps, to use for want of a better word, of the collective human psyche and its more unpleasant negative emotions, its grasping greed and its materialistic nature. So we have to maybe modify the way that we do think if we're going to cooperate with these kingdoms. First, of course, we have to accept that they're there because most people can't view them. To conclude, I want to just talk briefly about the work of another pioneering scientist in all this. And his work actually goes back earlier than Sheldrake's and earlier than the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he's a man you may have heard of called Cleve Backster. Now, Cleve Backster started life as, well, an interrogation expert for the CIA. He wasn't directly involved in interrogating people as far as we know, but he devised various hypnotic and drug techniques to get the truth out of people who were being questioned. And as part of that work, he started using lie detectors or polygraphs. And it's not quite clear exactly how this happened, but he started using these polygraphs on plants to find out their reactions to things and to find out whether these plants were conscious. And he found that initially that when they were wired up, if he said to them that he was going to cut one of the leaves off or destroy them, there was a galvanic response in that plant. But it was just when, and then he realized it also had an effect on the plant, not when he said the words, but when he just formed the thought in his mind that he was going to harm or damage these plants, the plants also reacted. But what makes his work even more interesting is that he also showed that the plants reacted to another kingdom of nature, the animal kingdom. He basically got a load of shrimps, and he found that when he was about to boil these shrimps and kill them in boiling water, the plants also reacted to that. They seemed to know that that's what his intention was. And so he tried all sorts of experiments by randomly dropping the shrimp into the water and various other things, but he seemed to get this reaction all the time from these plants, that they knew that something was going to happen. So these entangled minds that I've been talking about are not just human minds, because Theosophy tells us that everything has consciousness on its own level. And there are ranges of consciousness within each of the kingdoms of nature, so that a crystal or a diamond or a jewel will be more evolved than a more primitive type of rock. And that a 100-foot sequoia tree in California is perhaps slightly more evolved than a daisy. But, you know, we're not talking particularly about hierarchies, but we're talking about consciousness, and we're talking about how human consciousness is much more powerful than we've ever realized. And it's thanks to Theosophy and to similar thinking, tapping into these ageless ideas about consciousness, which were explored many thousands of years ago and then somehow got lost in the nooks and crannies of history, ideas which have been revived over the last century by Theosophists and others, that our thoughts are crucial in shaping the world. Our thoughts have shaped the world into what it is now, and our thoughts now have to work to remodel the world and to reshape it into the kind of world we want to live in. Because everything starts with our thoughts. Nothing starts on the physical plane, it all starts on the mental plane and then gets permeated through other subtle planes until it becomes physical. So we have to be very careful about what we think. Some of us find that very challenging. I do. I have some terrible thoughts sometimes, but I'm aware when I do have these thoughts that they are having an effect on the world. Thank you very much indeed. If you have any questions, I doubt very much whether I'll be able to answer them, but you're welcome to ask them anyway.